welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm an author of over 30 published novels and a ninth grade English teacher. And on this week's episode, I have Sue Hauser, and she's going to be talking about her middle grade novel, Walter Steps Up to the Plate, which was released recently through Kinkajou Press. Sue, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you for inviting me, and I am a native of New Mexico, born and raised. I started writing when I retired from being a social worker, and so I've written, I think this is my sixth children's book, and all of them related to New Mexico or New Mexico history in some way. I enjoy writing. I enjoy researching as well, and a lot of research went into this book. That is about my story. I live in Albuquerque and like to travel around the state. We have a lot of interesting stories people may not have known about that I didn't know about, so it's fun to discover this. That's about me.
Thank you for sharing that. And one of the other things I really was excited to see about this book when Jeff from Artemisia/Kinkajou sent it over was he had quite a few books that were baseball related. And I love baseball. So that was fun, especially since baseball just got started recently. We're recording this about mid-April, so we're kind of just getting into the swing of baseball season. And that was something I share with your main character, with Walter. Tell us a little bit about just the book's premise and what readers can expect from this.
Well, the book actually begins on opening day of the Chicago Cub baseball season in 1927. And Walter goes to the game with his dad, and then afterwards his father tells him that his mother's been diagnosed with tuberculosis, and the doctor is recommending that she go to another climate, and they have decided to come to Albuquerque. But the father isn't able to come. He has to stay in Chicago and work. So Walter, at 12 years old, he's going to come with his mother on the train to Albuquerque, where they will live with an aunt and uncle and Walter's cousin. So this is very disturbing news to Walter, of course concerned about his mother. But it's a big change to leave Chicago to a place he's never been and relatives that he's never met before. But he feels very, very responsible for helping his mother recover. Believes it's going to be just a few months and they'll be back home. However, his mother gets worse and has to go into a sanitarium. He would do anything he could to help her. Wanders around Albuquerque. That's where a lot of history comes in, because in his spare time, and she's resting a lot, he explores the town, and it's fascinating to him. It's quite a contrast from a city of 2 million people, and Albuquerque at the time was about 10,000 people. It's a different culture, different pace of life, but he entertains himself that way. And then also he gets a paper route. He's concerned about the expense to the aunt and uncle that they're putting on the family. So Walter gets a paper route, gets him out of the house, but he has an accident on the bicycle, and the bicycle belongs to his cousin, and they have not become friends. It's been difficult on both of them to share a room, and this creates more tension within the family. But his mother goes into the sanitarium and improves, but then the doctor says she's going to need some expensive surgery. So he really is distraught, and his father back in Chicago, the aunt and uncle are very concerned and helpful, but he still feels the weight of helping his mother get well, that it's his responsibility. He happens to go on an excursion with his cousin. By now, they've sort of become friendly, and he goes on a laundry delivery trip to Jemez Springs, and on this trip, they see a man that's bucked off a horse and is injured. They stop to help him, and Walter recognizes him to be Al Capone. The cousin is unaware. He's never been to Chicago. He doesn't know about the Chicago mob and all the gangsters, but Walter recognizes him. So I guess I may be telling too much of the story here, but in the long run, they bring Al Capone back to Albuquerque and to recover, and he's in the hotel, but he wants Walter to run these errands for him. So Walter said his new job is becoming Al Capone's errand boy. Al Capone takes a liking to Walter. Walter wants to distance himself as much as he can and tries to, but Al Capone even offers to pay for his mother's expensive treatment. So Walter has a real dilemma. I won't tell you what the end of that is. Should he be indebted to a Chicago gangster? What would his family think? Would they be at risk? So he has to struggle with it and figure it out.
Well, you really put together a lot of conflict for a young 12-year-old boy he's changing locations, which is hard for anyone at that age to suddenly be uprooted and away from their friends. And then he's also got the stress of his mom's illness. And then this added conflict of having to make some pretty adult decisions without being able to talk about it with anyone. Because who are you going to tell that you're running errands for Al Capone in Albuquerque? Either won't believe you or, might set off some alarms to certain people.
Yeah, the wrong people.
So that was something I really enjoyed about this was that it's middle grade. So the vocabulary, the writing style, it's easy to read. I would feel comfortable handing this over to a kid in the middle grade age range and not concerned that they would struggle with it. I think you hit right on the mark with the language and vocabulary and portraying Walter as a very relatable character, which I thought was wonderful. But it's a very complex situation as well. Like there's a lot to prompt young readers to think about and consider how they might handle some of these situations because none of them are easy ones, really. I mean, that's going to be a lot of big emotions to handle, some tough decisions, and just the day-to-day interactions that you describe between the characters. It's a lot for a young boy to try to handle on his own.
Yes. And I think that in that time period, children were given more responsibility. So at times, I think he may seem older than 12. However, he internalized the responsibility. His aunt and uncle were there to help. I'm sure he could have talked to them, but he felt it was his responsibility to take care of his mom. A lot of it would be more maybe internal than external.
Absolutely.
Feelings that he had.
Well, and I think, like you mentioned, at that time period, younger children, he takes on a paper route at 12. I teach ninth graders, and I have a few students who work, and I'm kind of like, why are you working at 14? Like today, that seems unusual for a young adult of that age to be working 10 to 20 hours a week at a regular job. But that was very normal at the time for children to help out with the families. But it was also pretty normal for kids to be expected to just carry on and do, not really sit down and talk about feelings and stress and fear and, have that emotional support in the way that we might expect today. And even though he has a very loving family, he does seem to feel like, no, he's got to handle it and work through it and deal with it himself. It's kind of a different generational aspect there that struck me as well. He's really treated like an older child would be in our society today. He has a lot of freedom to roam and wander, and he's helping with the paper route. It's just funny. There were so many things where I'm like, there's no way a 12-year-old could just wander Albuquerque today. It's much more dangerous.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
did think that
No.
was a fun comparison looking between the different time periods. And you'd mentioned having to do a lot of research. And I wanted to ask you about that because we've got some pretty detailed descriptions and accounts of Albuquerque in the 20s. And you're doing a really nice job of describing Chicago before he leaves as well, and just what the stadium and the area surrounding it looked like at that time. So how do you approach your research, and then how do you make sure you're not overdoing it for the intended reader? Because it can get easy to get bogged down in all those details.
Right. And I hope that it didn't go too far in the book. I think, well, first of all, when I wrote it, it was during COVID, and so I had time to do a lot of research. and that was about, I focused on that. And again, I hope that, I think for people who like history, it's not too much detail. If you're reading it for the story itself, probably some people will skip that and focus on the plot, maybe. But what I did was, when COVID started and so much the business were closed, school was online, I came across an article put out by the city of Albuquerque, and it was about 40 pages long, and it told about early Albuquerque with a list of buildings and churches, schools. And so kind of for the fun of it, my husband and I just took the list to see which ones we could identify. And, we realized that we'd driven past some of these structures for years, but really never looked at them. And in reading about the Albuquerque in the early 20s and the railroads coming in, being the largest employer in the town, I could just kind of feel the energy, all this new construction and people seeing, opportunities here. So I thought, I wonder what it would have been like for a boy, and I picked Chicago because I have grandkids there. What if the boy came from Chicago and saw Albuquerque? What would it have been like for him? So that's how it started. And then I thought, what else was going on in the 1920s? So, of course, tuberculosis was a real pandemic across the world. So many people came to Albuquerque because of the tuberculosis. At one time, New Mexico had 55 sanitariums in the state. So people may go to smaller towns, which competed for the business, but the majority stayed in Albuquerque. And St. Joseph was the first sanitarium that was built. Well, as the other things going on at the time, baseball was a huge national pastime. So, Chicago was big. Walter lived near the Cubs baseball stadium, and it had just been named Wrigley Field that year. So that was, all of these things kind of came together. And also in 1926, the Atchison Topeka Santa Fe put a new first-class Pullman sleeping car train running from Chicago to Los Angeles, and they called it the Chief. So it was practically brand new when Walter would have ridden with his mother. Silent movies were still being run, and Jemez Springs was a popular resort, much smaller than it is now, but they had a resort that opened in 1925, Rancho Ria Resort, and it was owned by a businessman from Chicago. His name was Seth Cedars. So that resort attracted people from back east, and it was an expensive resort, so it was high rollers, maybe questionable business practices. And I think it's very likely. I mean, I've read articles that said Al Capone was in Jemez Springs, and I've read articles that said it's a rumor. Who knows? But it's very, very likely he could have been. So I thought, how can I pull all these, this view of the 1920s, pull it together into a story? And so that's how Walter came about.
I really like that. I think that's really neat that you found a time period that you felt like had a lot of interesting details to draw from, and then work to put them all together into one story. Because you really did bring a lot of interesting aspects of that time period into Walter's life. And that can be really hard because it can be hard to make everything fit together in a way that makes sense or doesn't feel too forced, especially when you're trying to go with, you've kind of got like 4 or 5 different things that you really put in. Yeah. And I enjoyed that they blended together so well. And I think using the perspective of Walter, somewhere familiar where he kind of knows about Al Capone, he's in the news, he's aware of him, he knows, kind of the popular things going on in bigger cities, and then bringing him to the smaller area of Bay where he's exposed to such a different culture and where he really starts to learn more about what tuberculosis is and how they dealt with that at that time. I thought was really interesting. You're seeing it from his perspective, so you don't have to go into overwhelming detail because he's a 12-year-old boy, so people aren't going to talk to him like that. And I thought that was really nice because for young readers, they learn a lot without being overwhelmed by the information that you're giving. And I thought you balanced that out really well. And I was going to ask you your experience, I guess, with writing young fiction in this age range. It's very specific. You need to know the vocabulary of 8 to 12-year-olds. What are they going to understand? What ideas are they going to grasp and find interesting? So there's really, aside from just writing an interesting, compelling story, there are these other factors there with either very young fiction and middle grade that readers may not always consider that that's something that the writer really has to work at and make sure that they're getting right. So how do you approach that, and maybe what advice would you give to someone interested in writing for young readers?
Yeah, there are guidelines for the vocabulary of certain ages, and so that's one resource. You can actually check what age level you might use a certain word, and another age level, a synonym that would be a better descriptive word. So that's one way to do it. I think, though, when it's historical, that even makes it maybe more difficult, because at that time period, during that time period, what words would have been used. And so it was kind of fun to look up some of the expressions. I think at the ball game in the opening chapter, one player catches a fly ball. And so when I was doing the research for baseball lingo during that period, I took the phrase "can of corn" that that could have been used, during the 20s when the player caught the fly ball. Walter yells out, "Can of corn," And I can't imagine who ever came up with that. It doesn't seem to relate at all. But it was a phrase, a baseball slang at that time period. So I actually think for me, it would be more difficult to write a contemporary story using the language of kids these days. So it would be, much, much different than what, I used in Walter's story.
Definitely. I think that would probably take being around people in that age group and listening to them.
Yeah, which you do every day. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that if that's not something you're exposed to on a day-to-day basis, that's probably a challenge to familiarize yourself and use the right vernacular for current day. What words are they using? What are they talking about? How do you not sound like, the mom?
Oh, right.
mimicking
Right.
kids. Like kids are going to pick up on that really fast. So yeah, that is a unique challenge. And I think that's
Mhm.
interesting how it might be easier to write historic language
Mhm.
and vernacular for a group because you can find those resources where it's detailed, where today we don't really
Mhm.
necessarily have easy
Right.
access to that. You kind of just got to be around kids
Yeah.
and listen to them talk
Yeah.
and hear what they're thinking and interested
Immerse
in.
yourself.
Yeah, which can be a challenge if you don't just have kids that age around you or work in an
Right.
area where you're around kids all the time.
Right. That's right. It's not only just the age level, but it's the time period the language has to adjust to.
Well, and I think as well with the language, looking at the information that's presented and what would have been said to Walter at that time, and
Mhm.
then still needing to kind of translate that a little bit into things that children today are going to understand and comprehend. And I liked that you didn't get overly technical, especially talking about his mom's illness with tuberculosis.
Mhm.
You had a really nice mix of interesting facts and details that I think a parent reading this with their kid or just reading it for fun would be really interested in. There was a lot of the history with, you mentioned Carrie Tingley and kind of the beginnings of her philanthropic efforts, which people in the
Mhm.
Albuquerque area today, are very familiar with that name. It's, we've got the
Mhm.
Carrie Tingley Hospital, we've got various other things with that Tingley name attached to it that
Mhm.
are recognizable and help kind of tie those eras together. But a lot of that is presented to Walter in some of the language of the time, but you also
Mhm.
made it very accessible for young readers today to understand some of the what we would look at today as unusual treatments,
Right. Yes.
unfamiliar ideas, but I think it all came across really nicely to where it's understandable, which again is not
Oh,
always an easy task.
oh, well, thank you.
With some of those details, you mentioned toward the beginning of this being a big area for people to either come out here temporarily or long term dealing with health issues, which
Mhm.
is kind of, you think about it from today's perspective, kind of an odd thing to build up an area. But that
Mhm.
was the climate here was ideal for people recovering. And that was
Right.
what brought quite a few people during that time period to this area. And you give this idea and this glimpse of how that influenced the development of this area, especially around Albuquerque and the outlying areas like Hemet Springs, and how that kind
Mhm.
of played into this area's history in a really unique way, I think.
Well, thank you. Yeah, railroads, tuberculosis, ranching, mining really developed New Mexico. That just seemed like a logical way for the story to go.
Well, and I did want to ask you, we're starting to get close to being short on time, but you're bringing in of baseball, like you mentioned in the 20s, especially anyone near a town with baseball was following it. It was widely of interest to Americans, and you bring in some of that a little bit more in the beginning where we have Walter at the baseball game and we're getting some of those descriptions. And like you said, the can of corn, which was a funny one. I had never heard that before. So bring in, or I guess discuss a little bit, kind of looking at the more popular aspects of the culture of that time. And
Mhm.
obviously you went with baseball in that one, but that's kind of an interesting aspect of writing historical fiction, blending the facts of that time period with some fictional interactions. And you have a little bit of that where Walter gets to meet one of the players, and kind of similarly with Al Capone and bringing in some of the facts that we
Mhm.
know, and then using some of those rumors or some of those extra little details to bring some of the popular culture and interest and news and all of that of a time period into a fictional story. So just interested in your process for approaching that. How much, how little, what do you tweak and bend, and what do you leave just as is on a factual basis?
I did try to be as accurate as I could about the historical part, the details. For instance, like Wrigley Stadium, there were things I wanted to add, but it didn't happen in 27. Maybe it happened. It was like 1930. 1930, the big marquee Wrigley Stadium went up. But, at first I had that in my story. But then doing the research, it didn't happen until a few years later. If I wanted to keep Capone in the story before he went to prison, I needed to keep it in the 20s. So I went through a lot trying to pinpoint, details so that I kept it accurate for that time period. The story itself, was fun then to play with. I could go anywhere with that, with the fiction part of it. The historical part, I believe I feel confident it's all accurate.
I think that's a great thing to point out, like really doing that research and making sure that the historical details you include are researched and accurate, and then taking that creative license with the fictional characters and the story development itself. I think that's a really interesting blend. I don't really do historical fiction because I don't have time to research to that level on something like that. I find that maybe someday, but certainly don't have that time right now. So I admire people who can really dig into that and really take the time to be accurate as well. So I really enjoyed both the fictional parts and the historical aspects. I learned a lot about this area and during that time period. And it was just a really enjoyable, fun, and heartfelt story as well, with the family elements and getting to see early Albuquerque through Walter's eyes.
Oh, well, thank you. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, and I'm sure we could dig into a few more things, but we are out of time.
Okay.
So I did want to remind our listeners that the name of the book is Walter Steps Up to the Plate, and that's by Sue Hauser. And Sue, where can people find you online, and where can they find the book?
Well, I have a website, and it's SueHauser, .com. Then the book is on Amazon and also through the publisher, Kinkajou Press, and that's spelled Kinkajou Press.com.
Wonderful. And that's an imprint of Artemisia Publishing, which our listeners are familiar with. We have a great relationship with them, and I get to interview a lot of their local authors, which is wonderful. And I'm glad you were able to be a part of that, and that I got to read your book. So I hope that readers take a minute to check it out, especially, like, I enjoyed reading it as an adult, but I think young readers in that middle grade age range, I think will really enjoy the story and learning about the time period as well.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, thank you so much.